First, let me just say that it's not only nomadic peoples, it's all indigenous peoples in the world, including nomadic peoples, and local communities. These folks, their whole way of life is all about conserving nature. In other words, states, governments, one of whose products is international organizations and international conventions, states have been in the business of conserving nature for only a century, just barely more. You know, the original famous two national parks in the United States in the West that were created by the United States government, Yosemite National Park and Yellowstone National Park, the big models for every other state protected area. They originated not for the sake of conserving nature or wildlife or something, but as huge buffer zones between the occupation forces moving west and the indigenous peoples who were resisting this occupation. So unfortunately, ever since then, the issue of conservation of nature has been controlled by colonialism. This is a fact. Go to Africa. Who started this business of formal protection of parks, national parks, game parks, all of these? Colonialists, whether they were English, French, whatever. In Asia, similar. Look at India. We're in India now. Okay? The history of conservation of forests and all that goes back to British laws and British impositions. On what? Over what? Over the people who knew better than anything how to conserve nature and how to live with it sustainably. Let me just quote for you the official definition of conservation, straight from the horse's mouth. Who's the horse in this case? The IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, that every conservation organization and government belongs to it. And WWF, World Wildlife Fund, or Worldwide Fund for Nature, whichever one you take, some of them have taken that, and UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program. Together, 1980, they put out a publication, very important one, called World Conservation Strategy. World Conservation Strategy defined conservation as having three components. What was it? Strict preservation, that's part of conservation. Sustainable use, that's another part. And third, restoration. When nature becomes kind of damaged, you restore it. All three of these have been done for thousands of years, masterfully, by local communities and especially by indigenous peoples. That's what they do. Let's take nomads as an example of this. I mentioned all of that because the ICCA consortium that I preside over concerns all of this, all community and indigenous peoples' conservation of their territories and areas all over the world, okay? Now, nomads are a special case of that. Nomadic peoples, pastoralists, in most of the world, certainly in Asia, Africa, and even South America, they consider themselves indigenous peoples organized in tribes, clans, and these sorts of formations who migrate because the territories in which they live a sustainable way of life cannot be used, for example, grazed all year round. We have two kinds of nomadism, horizontal and vertical. Horizontal is in much of Africa, parts of Asia. Vertical is where you have highlands and lowlands. So in the summer, in Iran, for example, most of the nomads will go to the higher elevations in mountain areas because there's water, there's grass, the two things the components that they want. And in the winter, warmer season, if they stay up there in the winter, I mean in the colder season, there'll be nothing but snow and avalanches, and nothing can live there. So they move down intelligently to the warmer areas, to the valleys and plains in the lowlands where there is also water and where there is grass.
Sure, but the way the world seems to be going, which is a way of sort of people owning tracts of land and these nomadic lifestyles, which are sort of dying out across the world. I appreciate, you said earlier that they're still alive in Europe and other parts of the world, but the way the world is working, these lifestyles are dying out. So how can you bring these back? How can you bring this back into some kind of legislation? Because the way governments think, they think about ownership of land. I don't suppose they think about sort of people moving in a fluid kind of way.
Okay, you are a group that works a lot on climate change issues. Surely you've dealt a lot with the concept of resilience, okay? Nomadic peoples are probably the most resilient indigenous peoples in the world, even those who are not indigenous but nomadic. For example, the pastoralists in Europe, they're resilient. After the Second World War in Europe, and this philosophy came to us as a colonialist intervention, the government said, oh, this mobile way of life, migration, seasonal migration, that's passé, that's old stuff. Let's stop it, because now we need a lot of food, we need to go into industrial production of animals, and we don't need this anymore. So they discouraged migration, seasonal migration, up the Alps, down the Alps. In Spain, up the mountains, down the mountains. In Eastern Europe, in Scotland, everywhere. So they started to discourage that. Soon to find out, for example, that the ecology of the highlands of the Alps was being destroyed into monoculture of pine trees. And yet the meadows of the Alps are among the richest biodiversity habitats of the world. Okay? So they realized that in fact industrial production is going to even destroy the health of the people. I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole different topic. If you had half a day, I'll tell you about it. Okay? And then they started to go back. European governments now beg, kneel before the pastoralists to please migrate again. Sure. Some countries give them incentives, they give them subsidies to keep migrating, and the whole life is coming back to the habitats. Spain has a law, you talked about legislation. Yeah. Spain has a law called La Ley de las Vías Pecuarias, I think, okay? This law protects the migration territories of mobile pastoralists. They have, well, systematized it, being very nice Europeans with a, Cartesian way of thinking, into 3 types of migratory paths based on width, and it is consecrated into the law. Every 10 years they review it, but there is something like almost 500,000 hectares of grasslands just in these migratory paths. You can get yourself a flock of sheep or of cattle and keep migrating there all your life, never need anything else outside of that. So, and the same in much of the rest of Europe. I'm mentioning Europe because Europe, unfortunately for many of us in the developing world, now I come from Iran, West Asia, but you have the same situation in India, in China, in Central Asia, in Africa, much of Africa. There's, of the 50 or so, 51 countries in Africa, 31 of them at least have nomadic pastoralism in them. Okay? And all of these are thriving and coming back. Those states that were backwards and decided to discourage migration are now realizing that this is a major way of life. Where is it dying? Okay. You know, there are pressures, but the resilience is there. And the point I was making for conservation, do you want me to go into that? Yeah. Okay. One of the presenters in this session who's from the United Nations Environment Program, was saying, sort of bemoaning the fact that for her, in the arid lands of the world, there are only 9% of the land which is conserved, which is under conservation, protected areas. Yeah. And I sort of got excited and screamed. I said, no, from the point of view of the nomads, if you look at the arid lands, maybe 90% of the land is conserved because they conserve them. It's either sacred lands, sacred mountains, sacred groves, or the migration territory of nomadic pastoralists, indigenous nomadic pastoralists. And they migrate, as I said, but who do they learn from to migrate? You know, human beings are pretty intelligent, but not quite as intelligent as the rest of nature. My ancestors as a nomad about, scientists think, 10 to 12,000 years ago, they learned nomadism. From whom? Because they were collectors and hunters. They hunted wild animals like mountain sheep and wild goats and things like that. And these animals were migrating seasonally. They were not stupid enough to stay in the snow in the winter or in the heat in the summer. So because they were depending on them, they learned how to migrate with them. Eventually they domesticated them. And then eventually still they domesticated the dog, because the dog allows a flock. You know, I don't know if you have ever done what I've done. Take a whole flock of sheep, 500 sheep. If you don't have a dog, you're likely to come back with 10. If you have a dog, you'll get back very likely all 500. Okay? So this way of life, why do they migrate? Number one, to conserve nature. Because if they don't conserve nature and its resources, next year, next season, nature will have nothing to give them. They know that. So these people have conservation territories. The entire territory of migration of the nomads is a conserved territory for them. And conservation people, whether in IUCN or in governments, they don't even see this, because they only see official managers, lots of big budgets and all that, and they complain all the time. They talk about management effectiveness. What is more effective than a tribe that manages a forest or a thing, and if they cut a tree when they're not supposed to, getting punished, jailed, you know, whipped, and worse than that, I've seen in Sudan, being deprived of their sugar quota. Okay?
Wow.
Cultural sanctions to conserve, much stronger than anything governments can impose.